So what I'm going to do next is just give you a broad overview of what to expect in the next 2 days. It'll be a very high-level flyover, excuse me, and it'll just be an appetizer to what's to come. This slide is of a 22-week gestation brain. We are a Fetal Brain Symposium. We're going to ultimately be focusing on the effects of the issues that we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus that as it relates to the fetal brain. Why I put up this 22-week gestation brain is there are several reasons for that. First of all, 22 weeks or the middle of gestation is a time when obstetricians generally perform what's called an anatomy scan, and we begin to get the first look at the major organ systems, including the brain. And from that point on, based on what we find, the organs of that baby are in the care of the medical system. 22 weeks is also the lower limit of viability. Some babies, rarely, but some babies do survive after being born at 22 weeks. Often not unscathed. And so these babies are also under our, on our watch and in our care. And so what happens to them over the rest of pregnancy or the rest of ex utero gestation, if you want to call it that, is in our hands to a large extent. I also show you this because the brain at this stage, the brain at a point when the smallest preterm babies come into our care is 2 ounces in size, fits into a salt shaker like this. Over the next 22 weeks, the brain grows 8-fold and undergoes this dramatic increase in complexity over the surface of the brain with a vast expansion of the cortex of the brain, and all of this infolding occurs. And this process is largely what distinguishes us from lower species. This is also a period, and primarily because it is so developmentally intense, that the brain is most vulnerable to any influences from the outside that may be unnatural. So this period, this 22-week period in the lifespan, is the most dramatic in terms of development and invulnerability. The topic that we're going to discuss over the next 2 days and the environmental influence thereof on the fetal brain is a little different, as we'll learn. Many of the influences that ultimately impact upon the developing brain might originate prior to conception even, and certainly prior to the 20-week mid-gestation time point that I mentioned here. And because this is a mother-baby related environmental influence, it extends across the early infancy and beyond. But the most intense period is around this 22-week period and at its edges. So moving on to the topic of this symposium, pregnancy-related mental health disorders. Sorry. It's long been suspected, known that the female reproductive system has some link to the female mental state, mood, etc. And it's no mistake that the words hysteria and hysterectomy share the same Greek root. And there are still some dark corners of this world where hysterectomies are performed for mothers with difficult mood and psychiatric disorders. And this has been the thinking over centuries, but more recently, the thinking changed dramatically in this area. First of all, it became recognized that this was not a rare event, that it was actually a problem of enormous magnitude that was vastly underestimated and underdiagnosed. Another very important aspect of the new thinking has been the association between these maternal mental health disorders and the psychoneurological outcome of the offspring. And perhaps most worrying of all, and we'll have speakers that will discuss this, several of them I think are going to touch upon this, but there is evidence emerging that there is an intergenerational and perhaps even a transgenerational, i.e., a baby is affected in utero, might not develop the symptomatology, but can still pass that risk on when that mother has her babies in future. And this, of course, is very concerning when one thinks about populations living under severe psychosocial stress, that stress being passed on to the fetus, that fetus then being tagged or primed to be vulnerable to the same process, locking it into a cycle of misery. And that's obviously a very big topic and one I'm not qualified to say more about. The magnitude of this problem, as I said, is immense. Up to 25%, 1 in 4 pregnancies in this country, and that translates to about 1 million pregnancies a year, are affected by mood disorders, making it now the most commonly recognized pregnancy complication. And I think, as I said earlier, these estimates are probably underestimates. That translates on a global level to 32 million pregnancies a year. Very worrisome as well is the fact that between 5 and 15% of pregnant mothers express or demonstrate behaviors of self-injury, making pregnancy-related mental health one of the most common causes of perinatal maternal mortality. As Faith mentioned, there are, in this country, in this town, in the capital of the universe, a couple of miles away from here, there are major disparities between low-income African-American women living in the shadows of the temples of government and people uptown. So these disparities persist, and we're going to be talking about them, particularly in the context of our panel discussion. And by the way, Faith is going to be part of that panel discussion. This problem has such magnitude that the World Health Organization in 2015 declared maternal mental health in pregnancy a major public health issue and one of the most neglected areas of obstetric care. So that's by way of background, and I hope I've convinced you that this is an enormous problem. So whenever we think about influences on pregnancy, we have to consider a number of factors, such as the mother, the placenta, the baby, and whatever the outcome is that we're measuring. In this symposium, we're going to discuss maternal mental health, how it influences fetal brain development, and we're going to talk about outcome. In the first session today, between now and the lunch break, we're going to have David Rubinow, Neil Epperson, and Catherine Monk discuss various aspects of maternal mental health. David is going to start off talking about the different manifestations of mental health disorders, the different phenotypes, the terminology, the diagnostic criteria on a broad level. And this is critical because this is a very young discipline, embryonic, one might call it. Many different disciplines encounter the fetal brain in some way or another, or it's the repercussions of fetal brain problems. But the discipline of fetal neurology and fetal neonatal neurology is very young. And when you have a multidisciplinary sort of origin to a discipline, it is critical that the various disciplines within that growing field are using terminology correctly, rigorously, and uniformly, consistently across the group. And so I know that I have forgotten just about everything I learned about psychiatry many years ago, and could certainly do with a refresher course. There are many disciplines that don't get training in psychiatry. And for all of us, I think this is going to be very important as we think about the potential magnitude and the causes of issues in our young babies. They're also going to cover the various precipitants or stressors that either lead to intensify or magnify these maternal health issues, such as endogenous issues, part of the pregnancy itself, and exogenous issues such as psychosocial stressors. We'll also hear some discussion about some very interesting data suggesting that preconceptional, so this is before the egg and the sperm get together, there are already certain ways in which the baby that's going to result from that union is already tagged even before it's even hooked up its DNA. There's also going to be discussion about vulnerability, which mothers are more vulnerable. And I think Tracy's going to talk about the issue of early life trauma in young girls that sets them up into a setup of emotional dysregulation, rendering, and I think Catherine's going to talk about that too, rendering them all to stressors that other mothers might be able to overcome. In the afternoon session, we deal with what for me is a very interesting and novel way of looking at this, and that is, what are the actual messages? How does the message of maternal stress translate into a disturbance in the baby? Obviously, the placenta is involved in this in some way or other, be it through epigenetic signaling, endocrine signaling, inflammatory and microbiome, amongst others, signaling. But this is going to be a very intense and very interesting session. And it's going to be run by Tracy Bale, by Patrick Wadwa, and by Dan Weinberger. At the end of today's session, we're going to have a brief overview or brief introduction to next year's symposium. We have an award ceremony for some very special ladies that have supported this symposium. And then after that, we're going to go and have some cocktails. Tomorrow, the focus is going to be much more heavily on the newborn and the offspring of these pregnancies. Obviously, as you know, postpartum depression is a very worrisome postpartum complication. And in situations where a mother is trying to adapt to motherhood and she's going through these mental health situations, the critical period of attachment and bonding might be seriously and permanently damaged. And Martha Welsh is going to talk to us about one particular aspect of this, and that is the premature infant in the NICU that stays separated in many ways from its mother for a prolonged period of time when the baby is critically ill. And this is, excuse me, this is important because maternal stress and anxiety and depression during pregnancy is an important cause of prematurity, fetal undergrowth, and other complications of pregnancy. So in these mothers, there is a very real chance that Babies are born prematurely in mothers that are already psychologically fragile and prone to a further postpartum exacerbation of their mental illness. We're also going to talk in the early part of tomorrow about the various manifestations or putative manifestations of pregnancy-related mental health disorders, including some very interesting talks that are reports of imaging studies, both in the fetus and in the newborn. And then tomorrow we end up the symposium with what I think is going to be the most important part of the symposium, where we all get together and there'll be a roundtable discussion at the front here, but talk about from various aspects where to now, policy-wise, advocacy-wise, research-wise, funding-wise, all very critical issues that we need to deal with as this discipline grows. Lastly, and this next part is actually going to be covered in the first session, first and second sessions, and this gets back again to the outcome of mothers that, as fetuses and young infants, went through these difficult relationships with their mother, with mental health issues interposed, and how that has set them up when they become mothers to this intergenerational transmission, putting them back at the front of the cycle again and ready to perpetuate this misery. So a lot to cover. One of the best things about organizing this symposium has been the enthusiasm which the speakers have agreed, with which they have agreed to be part of it. They get this phone call from a guy that speaks kind of weirdly and they've never heard of before, asking them to come to a meeting on the fetal brain. The enthusiasm and the excitement was really gratifying. This is a quotation that I heard on National Public Radio recently. The future is already here, but it is not yet evenly distributed. I hope by the end of this symposium you'll agree that we've gathered together some serious future distributors as speakers, and that we all leave with the future evenly distributed between us, or more so than before.